Hello and welcome to the Port of LA's July media briefing. I'm Philip Sanfield. As we reach the halfway mark of 2026, a great deal's happening across supply chains, business planning, and the global economy. Joining me to examine how these developments are shaping cargo movement through America's busiest port is Executive Director Gene Seroka. Good to see you, Gene.
Great to see you, Philip, and good to be here with everyone today. As we do each month, let's get right into it. We'll begin with our latest cargo data. The numbers always tell the story, and right now, they're telling an important one. The containers moving through our docks provide a real-time snapshot of how businesses are navigating an ever-changing trade landscape. After the data report, we'll welcome our special guest, Dartmouth professor Douglas Irwin. He's one of the nation's leading trade economists and a widely respected expert on tariffs. In this complex and shifting environment, Doug will help us distinguish between immediate developments and the broader forces shaping global trade. Following our discussion, Doug and I will be happy to take your questions.
Gene, our latest numbers are off the charts. Please walk us through these great results.
Philip, June was a historic month for the Port of Los Angeles, and I mean that in the truest sense. We processed more than 1 million container units, making this the best June in our 118-year history. It was also our third best month ever, and the third time we've crossed the million TEU threshold. No other port in the Western Hemisphere has hit the million mark even once. These remarkable milestones didn't happen by accident. They're the result of businesses adapting to uncertainty and the Port of Los Angeles delivering the reliability our customers count on. Now, if there's one driver behind this historic month, it's imports. So let's break those numbers down. We handled 530,000 import units in June, an increase of about 13% compared with a year ago, and 18% above our 5-year average. In fact, this was our third highest import month on record. Yet, the numbers only tell part of the story. Importers aren't simply moving more cargo now, they're moving it differently. Many companies have stepped away from traditional seasonal shipping patterns, advancing cargo whenever they see an opening rather than waiting for perfect conditions. In other words, retailers are making strategic decisions about when and how much to ship, balancing back-to-school and holiday demand against tariffs, rising fuel costs, and global uncertainty. Meanwhile, exports totaled 126,000 TEUs, essentially flat compared with last June. Despite the strength we're seeing on the import side, American agricultural and business interests competing in overseas markets continue to face headwinds. Rounding out the picture, on the empties side, we handled approximately 345,000 containers, up 17% year over year. That equipment is heading back across the Pacific to support continued import demand. So, where do we stand at the halfway mark? We've moved 5.1 million TEUs, about 3% ahead of last year's pace and 4% above that all-important 5-year average. That's a strong performance by any measure, but especially meaningful given all the uncertainty businesses have navigated for some time now. June also marked the close of our fiscal year here in Los Angeles. We finished with 10.4 million TEUs, making it among our best fiscal years in port history. That's another milestone that reflects the consistency of this port and the people who keep it running every day. The women and men of the ILWU, our terminal operators, truckers, rail partners, and all our stakeholders, they made this possible. Their professionalism, collaboration, and commitment to excellence are the foundation of all these remarkable accomplishments.
A lot to celebrate in those numbers, Gene. And here's the natural follow-up. What does the second half of the year look like from where you sit?
Philip, if the first half of the year taught us anything, it was that we continue to be in a dynamic cargo environment. We know some cargo is pulled forward as businesses respond to uncertainty. However, at some point, those shipping patterns will normalize and volume will moderate. It's worth keeping in mind also that we're comparing against an exceptionally strong second half of 2025. Last July, we exceeded 1 million TEUs as well, and August approached 960,000 units. Those are challenging comparisons for any port. That said, the data we're seeing today suggests that the month of July should be another solid one, with cargo volume remaining above 900,000 container units. Beyond that, the picture gets a little harder to read because businesses are adapting in real time and conditions keep changing. There are several factors at play here. Trade policy remains front and center, including what happens after next Friday, July 24th, with the Section 122 tariffs. We'll also be staying on top of developments in the Middle East to understand their impact on transportation costs and broader economic indicators. Through all this, one constant stands out: the resilience of the American consumer. People are still shopping, businesses are still replenishing inventory, and cargo owners continue to find ways to move forward. So, where does all this leave us? The first half of the year has been stronger than many expected, and that gives us real momentum heading into the second half. Momentum that's built through planning, investing, and adapting to change. That's how the Port of Los Angeles has earned the confidence of its customers, and how we'll continue to serve them in the months and years ahead.
Thank you, Gene. A lot to absorb there. To help us put it all into perspective, would you please introduce today's guest?
My pleasure, Philip. Joining us from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire is Professor Doug Irwin. Doug's work has helped shape the national conversation around trade policy for decades. In addition to teaching, writing, and research, he served on the staff of both President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Policymakers and business leaders regularly turn to Professor Irwin for perspective on tariffs, trade agreements, and global commerce. Doug, it's a pleasure to have you with us today from Hanover, New Hampshire.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Doug, to start off, you've spent your career studying trade policy and its impact on economies, businesses, and consumers. As you look at today's landscape, what are the most important trade developments you're watching, and why do they matter?
Well, I've studied trade policy for quite some time, and it used to be a very quiet field. There were only maybe one or two things that one had to focus on, and now it's a target-rich environment. There's so many things that one has to keep track of. I'd say number one on the list, of course, is President Trump. He has been a single-person driver of U.S. trade policy in his second term as well as his first, and he has very strong views about trade policy. And there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of changes that he's been driving, and we'll talk about some of those changes that are coming up. So for the next 2 years, at least, we still have to keep our eye on what the president believes about trade and how he might act. But then all the regional actors are important too. So we have to think about the renegotiation of USMCA and what our commercial relationship will be with Mexico and Canada moving forward. Obviously, there's our two largest trading partners. It's going to be very important how that works out. China is another wild card. We're sort of in this uneasy truce with China, but you don't know when that's going to rise to the top of the agenda. And of course, another thing I'm looking at is the European Union, which is trying to figure out its policy with respect to China. Are they going to mimic the US and block EV exports from China to the EU? Or are they going to be open to a trade agreement with China? We just don't know at this point. But there's so many balls in the air with respect to trade policy. It's obviously, as you said, it's a challenging environment and a challenging time for businesses and consumers.
And right off, in a little over a week, Doug, next Friday, the 24th of July, we see those Section 122 temporary tariffs that were announced back in February being eliminated or expiring. What should businesses be paying closest attention to now and over the next few weeks?
Well, you're absolutely right. Those tariffs are going to roll off. And I'd say there are two things to keep one's focus on. First of all, those tariffs are going to be replaced by new tariffs under Section 301, and there's sort of two tranches. The first one is going to sort of replicate, in some sense, the 122 tariffs. They're going to be a flat tariff of 10 to 12.5%, ostensibly for other countries not complying with forced labor provisions and trade agreements. So that's going to sort of just continue on with the 122 regime, if you will. But there's some other looming tariffs on Section 301 we'll get to in a moment. There's a lot more uncertainty. But the second thing that happens next week is that the de minimis provisions in the U.S. tariff code are going to be eliminated, and small packages will have to go through this special tariff process. So this may not affect you in Los Angeles with big containers coming in, but for a whole host of importers that bring in smaller valued items, are used to easy shipment of those by mail without much bureaucratic interference, that's going to change. And so the small importers are really going to be affected by the new compliance requirements that the government's establishing.
That's really important. We've seen companies like JD, Shein, Alibaba, and even our own consolidators bringing in those smaller parcels. And it's not just for you and me buying online, but it's also smaller retailers, family-owned businesses. I recounted a trip I made up to Melrose Avenue in West Los Angeles and West Hollywood, where folks had really for years focused on getting these products into their storefront. And then suddenly they were hit with tax hikes that were almost insurmountable based on the size of their business. It's going to be a big deal for us coming up.
Yeah, and not only will they have to pay the import surcharge or the tariff on those goods now, but just the bureaucratic compliance in terms of shipping forms and things of that sort is going to sort of gum up the works for a bit until we sort of settle in and realize how the system works.
And here again, just like the old adage, there is nothing small about running a small business.
Right.
Beyond this, Doug, where should we be looking when it comes to trade policy? Where does it go from here in the next 6, 12, 24 months through the end of this administration's term?
Well, I sort of led into this a little bit when we were talking about what the new tariffs are going to come in after July 24th. And we did say that the U.S. Trade Representative's Office has already announced these 10 to 12.5% tariffs on forced labor provisions, or that's the rationale, going to be applied on many, many countries. But there's another looming Section 301 set of cases that deals with a smaller set of countries that deals with, or is said to deal with, excess capacity and, in some sense, dumping of foreign goods. So there's going to be a number of big countries that we buy a lot from that will be affected by this. We don't know those rates. But here's where the uncertainty plays in. The forced labor provision, Section 301 tariffs, those are pretty much flat tariffs, as I suggested before. In other words, it's all the same for most countries, only between 10 and 12.5%. But the second round of 301 tariffs could replicate what we saw on Liberation Day. That is, under Section 301, the president has a lot of discretion in terms of what the tariff rates are by country and commodity. And so what you could see is when those are announced, and we just don't know yet, those tariff rates could be much higher, and there could be much greater variance across countries, really hitting certain countries hard and other countries less hard. So with the 122 tariffs and then the new Section 301 tariffs that under forced labor, those are pretty flat across different countries. So you didn't really have to pick and choose where you're sourcing your supply from. You're going to pay the same tax. But with these new 301s, they could be very, very different across different countries. And what that means is big reshufflings of supply chains, depending on what those tariffs are. Then the other question is, okay, are those just an initial bargaining tariff, or are they going to be in place for some time? Are they going to be changing month to month, or are they going to be fixed? And once again, that's going to, we'll have to get some indications from the administration about that. But that just adds another layer of uncertainty to importers in terms of sourcing and what they're going to have to pay. So I think this is sort of the environment we're going to be in for the next 2 years. Uncertainty about USMCA, uncertainty about the China relationship, and then uncertainty with these Section 301 tariffs. That's the most immediate threat to your viewers in some sense, because those are going to take effect very soon.
And under the category of I don't know what I don't know, we heard on the sidelines of the NATO meetings a week ago that the U.S. would consider cutting off all trade relations with the country of Spain, putting 20% fees on any ship based on the value of the cargo that crosses over the Strait of Hormuz. It just seems like there are so many things that have yet to be either divulged or explored that importers and exporters alike just have to keep a 360 view on every single day. Do you see these types of actions going on into perpetuity? Or maybe just for this administration, and then after the elections in 28, we get to another look at international trade policy? What's going to stick around, and what do you think we have a chance to course correct on?
That's a great question and a complex one. So President Trump really deeply cares about trade, and he likes tariffs, and they're a great source of leverage for him to achieve many, many objectives. So I think we're just in the next 2 years going to be in this environment where we'll get these threats about tariffs just against Spain. And at least initially, it's going to be hard to know how credible that is, whether that's just talk or whether there's going to be follow through. So we'll just have to sort of watch what the president says and try to see in the hours and the days thereafter whether these tariffs come to fruition. But I think there will be a settling down after the Trump administration. I think we've had so much chaos and volatility that any new administration, whether it's Republican or Democrat, will still be concerned about trade policy in a big way, but want more stability and want to put it on sort of on the back burner. Historically, that's the way it's worked. Presidents want to shape trade, but once they've sort of shaped it in the way they want, they move on to other issues. And with this administration, they never really move on. There's always something new, some new wrinkle that they can bring in. But that doesn't mean we go back to the status quo antebellum in some sense. We go back to where we were in, say, 2015 with respect to trade policy. Because once these tariffs go up, vested interests, supply chains adjust to them, vested interests have a stake in them. And so I think any new administration will have difficulty completely revamping trade policy, bringing those tariffs down. What tends to go up quickly sometimes comes down slowly.
Doug, thanks. Your perspective brings some clarity to these issues that sometimes can be really hard to find. We appreciate it. Philip, let's open it up to questions from the media now.
Very good. Thank you both. We do have some questions in the queue. If you'd like to ask one, please use the Q&A box below and include your name and outlet, and we're going to get to as many as we can today. The first question is for Doug. It's from Laura Curtis of Bloomberg. She asks, some businesses are now receiving refunds of tariffs imposed under the International Emergency Economics Powers Act, or EPA. Do you expect those refunds to have any meaningful impact on the broader economy? And if so, are consumers likely to benefit, or do they primarily help businesses offset costs?
I don't think we're going to see any big macroeconomic impact from the refunds. First of all, they're trickling out at a fairly slow rate and slow pace. So it's not like when the tariffs were imposed all at once, where they were sort of a big shock to the economy and to importers and exporters. You hear that the refunds are coming out over time. And so we won't see big impacts on the month-to-month data. There's an interesting asymmetry with respect to these refunds, however. When the tariffs took effect, importers largely passed those on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So the businesses themselves, obviously, they wrote the check to the government, but they passed that bill on to the American consumer. But with the refunds, don't go back to the consumer. The refunds go back to the importer that wrote to the government. And so what's going to happen is those firms that imported will get this windfall in some sense, but they can't really identify the consumers who paid those higher prices 6 months ago, 9 months ago or so. And so it's not clear what's going to happen to those firms when they receive the windfall or the refunds, whether they pass it on in terms of lower prices. It's sort of uncertain, but it's certainly not going to be the same consumers necessarily who paid the higher prices earlier last year, or what they're going to do with the money. So a lot of uncertainty there as well. It'll be very interesting to watch.
Thank you, Doug. This next question is for Gene. It's from Kelly Straw of Industry Dive. What's the latest you're hearing on how the Strait of Hormuz is impacting global shipping? Any impacts on the West Coast?
Thanks for joining, Kelly. For us, the immediate impact is the price of that fuel on the ocean-going vessels, the railroad locomotives, and the trucks that move about 2/3 of all the Port of LA's cargo in and out every single day. At the pump here in Southern California, gas prices are up 18 to 20% from a year ago. Diesel prices remain elevated at more than 25% higher. And the majority of our truckers in the harbor community are small to middle-sized businesses, so the impacts are real. When it comes to the service, we don't share crews, assets, or vessels with the cargo that goes to the Arabian Gulf, Red Sea, or East Africa regions in the Middle East. So our cargo's been moving pretty much unimpeded. Early days after the war began in February 28th, I was concerned about ports that we share, like Singapore, Shanghai, Yokohama, just to name three, with that cargo that runs to the Middle East. And after visiting Asia during the late spring and early summer, I can tell you those port directors and their dock workers and so many others have done a great job of making sure that cargo is segmented and our cargo is flying through to market as best it can without impacts of what's going on with the war in Iran. You know, it's interesting, Kelly, because about 10% of all the container trade worldwide emanates to and from the Middle East, yet it's taking up about 95% of the shipping community's attention. There's so much information coming out there. It changes every day. More than 40 declarations from Washington that we're at a ceasefire, a peace agreement, a deal of some sort, none of which have really panned out at this juncture. The fuel cost for a vessel now is probably upwards of 30% of a vessel voyage overall cost. So this is real money to these shipping lines. What's going to be next is that you'll see adjustments in the fuel surcharge that is passed on to importers and exporters, especially here in the United States. Typically, shipping lines have a formula approach that has to gather data over a 3-month time span to prove that the fuel they're using costs more than it did beforehand, and then they can assess that fuel surcharge to the cargo owners. That's what's coming next. So you'll see a bump there. And then when prices go down, usually that surcharge remains elevated and it lags for some time before it gets back to a price point that's a little more reflective of what we see today in a snapshot in time. So again, you know, having lived and worked in the Middle East for 5 years, I'm keeping in close touch with our contacts on the ground. There's much more work to do, even if this war ended today, which we have no indication of any time of a complete ceasefire. You're going to have to repair the infrastructure that's been damaged from all the bombing, whether it's the fuel apparatus at the Dubai International Airport, the LNG facilities in Qatar, the port terminals in Kuwait at Shuwaik and Shuaiba, or just to get Iran back up and running to produce fuel and extract it from the ground. Remember that extraction cost is about $5 a barrel, but realistically speaking, a lot of repairs, a lot of work on the supply chain, and future-proofing this region to prevent the impacts that we've seen to 20% of the overall fuel supply worldwide. And we're seeing better times than some. In Southeast Asia, the reliance on refined jet fuel is almost exclusively from Arabian Gulf nations. And in Europe, where I just was, in Hamburg on a visit for business, 75% of the EU's jet fuel in a refined capacity comes from the Arabian Gulf. There's a lot more work to do here. But so far, the Trans-Pacific trade continues to move and at good rates. Thank you.
Thanks. On the Mideast, question just came in for Doug. This is from Mega Bari from Al Jazeera Digital. She's asking, President Trump said that instead of a 20% fee on cargo passing through the strait, the Gulf countries would invest in the U.S. How effective and realistic is this kind of an idea? Doug?
Well, there's been sort of a theme of what President Trump has wanted going right back to the beginning of this second administration, where he wanted to not just get concessions from other countries with respect to trade and their ability to purchase U.S. exports, but investment commitments. It's part of the bringing manufacturing jobs back, bringing investment funds back to the U.S. and things of that sort. So he's tied in many foreign policy instances what the U.S. is doing to foreign investment commitments on the part of our foreign partners. One problem with this is that we don't know whether these are going to be monitored, whether there's some sort of accounting that's going on to ensure that there's compliance here, whether this is sort of a quick agreement that's sort of forgotten after it's been signed, even if there is a signed agreement. And so here, once again, we have this informal pledge, maybe, that other Arab countries will be making investments in the U.S., but we don't know the amounts, the timetables, the specificity. Is this an enforceable agreement? Is it a legally binding agreement, or is it more of a handshake deal? And so I think only time will tell how this will play out. And I think a lot of other countries, what they've done is there's ongoing investments. And the question is, do those count as part of this commitment, or is it something above and beyond those existing investment flows?
Great. Thanks so much, Doug. This question is from Jeff Berman of Logistics Management. It's actually for both of you. With respect to these new 301, 232 tariffs set to take effect, how do you expect importers, both retailers and manufacturers, to respond? I know you touched on this earlier, and there's a lot of question about what's coming. But Doug, why don't we start with you, and then to Gene?
Well, a standard economist cop-out answer is it depends. So this first round, as I mentioned, in terms of the forced labor Section 301 tariffs, they're sort of a continuation, or at least I view them as sort of a continuation of the 122 tariffs. They're pretty much flat across the board. No big changes in policy when we shift from one day to the next. But the big uncertainty is the excess capacity Section 301 tariffs. We haven't had an announcement yet on what those rates are going to be and how they're going to differ across countries. And I think it's very unlikely that they're going to be at some low, flat level across all countries. I think it's more likely that we'll get something possibly replicating what we saw with Liberation Day, pretty high rates and varying rates across different countries, depending on how much they're contributing in the administration's eyes to the problem of excess capacity. So that's the big aspect that we really don't know, and we're all waiting to see.
Gene, what are you hearing on this?
Well, it's a continuation of operations teams at companies on both the import and export side of our business here at the Port of Los Angeles that continue to do simulation exercises. If this tariff goes in and it's that much from this country on a commodity I import, what are my alternatives? And this is part of the reason why you saw the retail community advance shipments and inventories, because they just don't know what's going to happen with any level of specificity after these Section 122s expire. So the next piece is that, okay, my fuel prices are going to go up, which further adds value to let's get the stuff in here. Let's get it settled because I have a pretty good idea of my landed costs. Then I'm going to go back to the drawing board with my team and try to figure out what's next as the announcements either trickle out or come like a deluge from Washington. So it remains to be seen, and Doug is right. It depends on what these numbers come out like. And oh, by the way, let's not forget the American exporter who has been left behind in this entire episode. And it's not just so much the retaliatory tariffs that were put forward after last April's announcement on the big tariffs across 80 some odd countries, but it's the fact that in a very quiet way, sometimes revenge is served best cold. Let's make a deal on soybeans with Brazil and Argentina. Let's make another deal on almonds with Australia. Let's put Indonesia together with the EU. And then suddenly you've got collaboration happening and the U.S. is left on the sidelines. What leaves the U.S. on the sidelines and the resultant effect is harm to the American farmer and manufacturer. We've got to get those two segments that are so important to the American economy and our families back in the game.
Thank you, Gene. This question's for you from Bill Mongaluzzo, Journal of Commerce. Sea Intelligence maritime analyst reports that imports of consumer merchandise are beginning to soften, while imports of AI hardware for data center buildouts are booming. What implications might this have for imports in the traditional peak season coming now?
Well, Bill, I think this is really interesting, and thanks again for always joining from here in Long Beach, California. With the imports that have been pulled forward, again, best intelligence that we have right now on the ground, you'll probably see a little bit of a drop-off on that volume. But getting inventory levels up, and they were in no peril according to the St. Louis Fed's report on the inventory sales ratio that we keep up with pretty closely. And the fact that the American consumer is still buying. This Friday, I believe it is tomorrow, Friday in the United States, July 17th, we'll get the next readout on June retail sales. The May numbers were up 0.9 to 1%, pretty good, but also more than 6% above last May. So again, the indications are the American consumer is continuing their move forward. Yes, they're bargain hunting. They're buying a little bit differently. There is some inflationary impact. And when we separate out the price of gas and some of the other pieces that have been highly focused on when it comes to inflation, still generally speaking, pretty good. Right? And at the same time, while the jobs market is being readjusted, it's a little soft. We had a couple, 3 months of decent runs that had some recalculations. It has not fallen off a cliff. We haven't seen mass layoffs. And while inflation is high, it's not runaway. So generally speaking, this economy at $30 trillion, even if it moves forward at a 2% GDP growth rate, still pretty solid. Now, if because of these seasonal changes, we're starting to see a little bit more of the hardware, the electronics for industrial, and maybe some construction materials for AI and these data centers picking up, that matches up perfectly. And that's good news for us because every 4 containers mean a job. So if we're seeing the end of a less traditional peak season, as it were, and a pickup on the industrial side, I like where that's going. But let's keep all this in perspective. Just yesterday, New York Governor Kathy Hochul declared a 1-year moratorium on the construction of data centers in the state of New York, pending the outcome of a lot of discussion that needs to take place. There's been a frenzy of information and folks that are absolutely slamming on the brakes when it comes to these data centers because they're concerned that the consumption of power and water utilities is going to outstrip the demand of us as consumers. So we've got to level set this equation as well. Data centers coming in are probably going to have to be a little more self-sufficient, creating microgrids, specifically utilities designated to their facilities that doesn't impact the tax-paying community that surrounds them. So there's a lot more to learn here, but again, the import levels that we're seeing, especially from the port optimizer going out 40 days, don't show us really having a precipitous drop, and the cargo volume will continue. Got to get those exports moving, Bill, but thanks again for joining.
Thank you. The next question is from Rena Lee of China Daily Global Edition. This is for you, Doug. Recent months have seen continued dialogue between the U.S. and China alongside ongoing tariff and trade policy adjustments. From a historical perspective, how important are policy stability and predictability for businesses making long-term investment and supply chain decisions?
Well, that question almost answers itself in the sense that, yes, businesses absolutely need that predictability of the business environment to make medium-term and long-term investments. And that applies to trade and where you're going to source things from, as well as direct investments and the like. So here's where we are with respect to China, is that the administration, in some sense, has pursued some aggressive policies to deny it access to technology, but hasn't escalated the trade war the way we saw right after Liberation Day, when, remember, those tariffs hit 145%. They quickly came down. We're now stabilized, but we're in sort of this uneasy truce. So in terms of restoring U.S.-China trade, I think it's going to be difficult precisely because we don't have assurance that truce in some sense will hold. We could go back and the president could, and maybe after the USMCA renegotiation, turn back to China and want to ratchet up the pressure. or maybe we're in a new situation where China doesn't get touched as much and the tariffs remain stable. We just don't know, and that's going to be a deterrent to reinvesting in China or relying on China for imported goods, as opposed to going to a Vietnam or another Southeast Asian country, or maybe even more locally Mexico for long-term sourcing. So there's just this inherent uncertainty in the environment, and not much businesses can do except try to hedge against it as best they can.
Thank you, Doug. Gene, this question's for you from Paul Avery of World Cargo News. Descartes reports that port transit delays nearly doubled in June in Los Angeles area to 5.8 days. A port transit delay is the difference between the estimated arrival date and when Descartes receives the processed U.S. Customs bill of lading. To what extent does this metric reflect supply chain performance?
Well, thanks for the question, Paul. And it's an interesting one, but it's been something debated for long over a decade. On-time arrivals and departures have been elusive in the liner shipping industry for that time and even longer. There was a day that when I was working for APL, we judged a ship's on-time performance within a 4-hour window. And if we hit rough weather traversing the Pacific, we would simply put on the thrusters and go 28 knots and try to catch up on that time, because it was really sacrosanct to the client base that we served. But with rising fuel prices, different economics, and the fact that not everybody felt a 4-hour window was an absolute necessity in their service level offering, contract, or rate agreement, those terms got relaxed over time. Now, what this is a look at, if you say you're going to leave on a Monday and get to LA Friday at 0800 the next week, how do you measure up? And I count on you to get there. That's a real discussion between the cargo owners, the contract, and the shipping lines. But it's not a measure of port operations. And I'll explain why. The cargo ships that are coming here are staying for about 4 days. The average exchange of a vessel is about 12,000 TEUs. How many we offload, load back up to return to Asia. That's the best in the business. The dwell times on truck containers are at or below 3 days, better than it was before COVID. And remember, about 2/3 of all of our business moves in and out by truck, whether it's the local market or that which goes to and from the IE. The other piece to this, which is really important, is how you cobble all this together for the American exporter. And our friend Peter Friedman, who leads the Agricultural Transportation Coalition, continues the drumbeat of this earliest return date that's published. For example, a really complicated issue, but the ship comes in, it's unloading imports, it starts to load up the exports. At what time can John or Jane Q exporter deliver their box to get loaded onto that vessel? Well, if I deliver it a little too early because the ship is late arriving, I get charged demurrage or some other penalty. If I get there a little too late and miss the cutoff, that vessel sails and I've got to wait at least another week. So having synchronization of the vessel schedule to actual arrival departures, matching that up with what the needs of the American importer are, with that carried by the American exporter, requires a lot more precision than we're seeing today. Some companies are really taking that forward, like the Gemini agreement between Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk, really measuring exactly what they do and seeing some pretty good performance gains. Others are looking at this as well. Not an impact to port operations, a function of a really, really heavy peak season and an industry that's lagged in this area for some time, but not to be dismissive. Most that I talk to are focused on it every day. Thanks, Paul.
Doug, I'm combining a couple questions here from two different reporters. Have the tariffs achieved what the administration intended, and how do you evaluate whether they're succeeding?
That's a great question and a very important one. When the administration announced these tariffs and whether the president has justified them and some of his advisors, they've put several to reduce the trade deficit, to bring in money to the federal government as a tax revenue raising device, to reach better deals with other countries, Those are all great objectives in some sense, but the question is, A, do tariffs help achieve them directly? And B, are there trade-offs among those objectives so that you can't achieve all of them at the same time? So, for example, if the main goal is to raise revenue for the federal government, what that means is Port of LA is going to be in business. You want those imports to come in because you're taxing that business as it comes in. If those tariffs are too high and they deter trade, you're not going to raise as much revenue. If you're using the tariffs and the tariff threats to reshore jobs, but you also want to cut deals with other countries, cutting those deals means the tariffs won't go up as much, and you're not going to reshore as much domestically. So the one issue with the administration is they haven't prioritized which of those objectives are the most important. So you're going to achieve one or two of them, but you can't achieve all of them at the same time. And if you fail on one or two, you can always point to the success elsewhere. But more relevant in some sense to the whole issue of manufacturing and whether we can bring back manufacturing jobs and revitalize manufacturing industries. And this is very important for the Port of LA and elsewhere. About half of the U.S. imports are components and industrial products and supplies. And when you raise those prices through tariffs, you're hurting the competitive position of downstream users in the United States who use those as inputs to their production. So the classic example is steel. Have the steel tariffs helped out the U.S. economy? Well, it's helped out steel producers. Their profitability is much higher because of the tariffs. They get to charge higher prices. But if you're GM or Ford or Caterpillar or John Deere, you buy a lot of steel, and that's raising your costs. And your foreign competitors, Komatsu and others, don't pay those high costs in their own markets. And so you're operating at a cost disadvantage, both in the U.S. and when you're trying to export to other countries. The same with farmers. It's not exactly helped farmers because there's the implicit retaliation that was mentioned earlier, as well as the higher costs of farm equipment and fertilizer and the like. So whether it's a success or not depends on what your metric of success is. The administration has put out sort of many different goals it's trying to achieve. Some of them are achievable, but not all of them at the same time. And the question is, are the trade-offs worth it in the end?
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. This is the last question from Stuart Churls of FreightWaves. It's for Gene. Rail operations have slowed under the recent surge of intermodal traffic. What are you hearing from your rail partners at UP and BNSF as far as what they're doing to manage the issues, and what is the port doing to assist?
Thanks, Stuart. Appreciate you joining again. We're in regular communication with both Western railroads as well as our local coordinator, the Pacific Harbor Line, and volume's up. More cargo's moving. Networks get tested. Velocity is the most important thing that both Jim Venna at the UP and Katie Farmer at the BNSF look at every day. We're not seeing any evidence of broad slowdowns or disruptions. You know, what I see here locally in Los Angeles is that the dwell time of a box moving off a ship that's designated for on-dock rail is sitting now for about 5 days. That's a day above the higher end of my comfort zone. I'd like to see the dwell time for on-dock rail between 2 and 4 days. And we've been pretty much in that neighborhood for the better part of 18 months until more recent times when we've seen this volume pick up. But as I was getting ready this morning, coming down to the office, I looked at some of our historical statistics in the file, and I'll take you back to October of 2021. When we had 89 ships at anchor at that point. We had 97,000 import boxes on the ground. 37,000 were sitting 9 days or longer. And of that 37,000, 22,000 were rail boxes to be loaded on dock. This morning, we had about 1,300 boxes sitting 9 days or longer designated for rail. So compared to the worst we've seen, 22,000 boxes of aging containers, we got about 1,300 on the ground. I'd like to see that number at 0. So all in all, where we can start seeing some of these metrics going in a different direction, they're an early warning signal or an amber light if you're sitting at a cross section to say, hey, look, I'm starting to see this thing happening. Let's get on it. Let's take a look at it. But nothing in my view, from that vessel schedule to the work that's been done here to move cargo in and out, and then the Transcontinental Railroad, that spells disaster to me. It's always fine-tuned. There's always more work to do, getting those gondolas back here for the exporters and the next round of imports. All of that continues. But here again, you're seeing some pretty historic volume coming through this gateway as one barometer, some areas that we certainly want to improve upon in a variety of sectors, but nothing right now that spells any real concerns to us overall. Thanks for the question. Much appreciated, Stuart.
Gene, Doug, thank you both for handling that wide range of questions. I'll turn it back to you, Gene, to close us out.
Thanks, Philip. You know, we were just talking with Doug about the outputs or outcomes of this trade policy and the 3 R's. One thing of note that we keep a super close eye on here are manufacturing jobs in the country. And for a couple of reasons, obviously. They're so important to the economy, make up about 12% of the GDP itself. But we have got 100,000 more open manufacturing jobs in the country today than we did a year ago. And that's according to the National Association of Manufacturers CEO Jay Timmons. We've got over 529,000 manufacturing jobs open. There were a little more than 400,000 when we had this conversation exactly at this time last year. So there's a lot of work to do. These are good manufacturing jobs. We need to attract, recruit, and retain people, offer good training opportunities, and bring the next generation in, be able to get them excited about good jobs and good careers. But this is an area that's been talked about a lot by the administration, and to date, we've gone backwards. But Doug, we really appreciate you joining us today from the campus of Dartmouth College, and what a treat to have you, knowing so much about what you've done in the areas of trade policy and your work. It's been great that you had the opportunity to share some of your insights with us today.
Thank you. It was a wonderful opportunity and great to speak to you and to all the press that interest in these issues.
Before we finish, I'd like to leave you with one last number, and that's 97. Specifically, 97 minutes. That's how long it took the average truck to enter and exit the port here in LA at the height of the supply chain crisis back in 2021. And yes, there were some that took much longer than that and really struggled during that time period. Today, that number is 62 minutes for a reduction in wait times of more than a third. Now, for those less familiar, truck turn time measures how long it takes a trucker to enter the port complex, get in that queuing zone, cross the gate of the terminal, pick up or drop off their container, and exit on their way to the customer's facility or other points beyond. It's one of the clearest indicators of how efficiently a port is operating. And it matters tremendously to freight operators, cargo owners, and ultimately, us consumers. That's because 2/3 of our cargo moves in and out of the Port of LA by truck every day. So how did we get here? Years of investment, strong coordination across our supply chain partners, and smarter use of data. Terminal operators have upgraded their scheduling systems and gate management. Shippers and logistics companies, providers alike, are using cargo flow information more strategically than ever. And tools like the Port Optimizer with its universal truck appointment system continue to provide greater visibility across the entire logistics network. It's because of that system we've been able to schedule and honor more truck appointments per day at our gates than ever before. These benefits are being felt across the board. For cargo owners and retailers, it means a supply chain they can count on. For truck drivers, it means more productive runs and less idle time. And for the communities around this port, every minute a truck is not idling means cleaner air and a healthier environment for the families who live and work here. Truck turn times are just one part of a larger operational picture. We're also seeing that work on and off the vessel without delays, no backups of ships. cargo getting onto trains and moving in and out the gates faster than before, and fewer empty containers idling, taking up valuable port space here on the waterfront. They're being evacuated to Asia quicker than before, too. Across every part of this port, the supply chain is moving more efficiently than it has in years. And as we've covered today, once again, there's still much more work to do. But we're encouraged by all this progress and grateful to everyone who continues to make it possible. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again back here in August.